So I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker and former president of our club, Professor Ali Lumsden. Ali is Regius Chair of English Literature at the University of Aberdeen, where she is General Editor of the Edinburgh Edition of the Waverley Novels and the lead editor for an edition of Walter Scott's poetry. She is also Director of the University of Aberdeen's Walter Scott Research Centre, which exists to promote all aspects of research on Scott. She has published extensively on Scott and on other aspects of Scottish literature. Ali is a trustee and honorary librarian of Scott's Library at Abbotsford. Ali is going to speak to us today on A Pleasure Even in Living and Breathing, Nature, Consolation and Well-being in Scott's Journal. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you, Madeline. I'd just like to thank the club for actually organising this event and David for inviting me to talk today. It's such a fascinating topic for a colloquium because Scott's Journal, as we've just heard, is in many ways considered his masterpiece, and certainly it's one of the most honest and poignant pieces of literature we have from him. We also, as we've just heard, owe a considerable debt to our colleague Eric Anderson for making this valuable edition in such an excellent form, and indeed to Poppy, who helped with that. My topic for today might seem a bit of an unusual approach to the journal, and I just want to say at the outset that I'm not an expert either on the journal or on Scott and the environment. There are many people who have written about the journal, such example, my colleague Ian Alexander took really important work on that. And there are others who are far more expert on eco-criticism, such as Susan Oliver, whose excellent work, Scott and the Greening of Scotland, I would certainly recommend. I'm also indebted here to the work of Dr. Catherine Ferrier, who, while she was a graduate student at Aberdeen, explored the relationship between Scott walking in nature and well-being as part of an event for the Scott 250 celebrations. And I'll say more about that later. However, this week we've been reflecting on Scott, nature and well-being at Abbotsford because we've been enjoying Sheena Stone's wonderful exhibition entitled Enclosed I Will Be Safe, which of course, as this audience knows, is taken from Scott's bookplate motto inspired by an anagram of his own name in Latin. And Sheena's exhibition has offered us a series of textile pieces inspired by the connection Scott makes between trees, nature, and well-being. And that's available at Abbotsford until the end of tomorrow, so you've still got a chance to catch that in the gardens. But many of Scott's observations on this topic, on the relationship between nature and well-being, are taken from the journal, and therefore it seemed an appropriate thing to speak about today and just give some consideration to it, particularly, as I'm sure some of you know, we're just at the end of Mental Health Awareness Week. So that's why I chose this topic. So what are the connections between the journal, nature and well-being? Of course, as we all know, Scott is intrinsically linked to the natural world. As a poet and novelist of the Romantic period, his work contains vivid and majestic descriptions of landscape, which inspired many artists and prompted the burgeoning tourist industry in Scotland. I'd also say, though, his more detailed observations of nature are sometimes overlooked. But if we look at something like The Lady of the Lake, we can see that while we have those sublime descriptions of Loch Katrine and the surrounding mountains, we also have detailed descriptions of plants and flowers, such as the eglantine, hawthorn, and hazel, lodged in the fissures of the cliffs. So we have both that wide landscape and the detail. And this love of nature is carried over into his vision for Abbotsford and the ways in which the gardens and the wider landscape of the estate are imagined. Now, in Scott's own time, the most prominent landscape gardener was Capability Brown, who, of course, is famous for remodelling so many of England's great country houses and for creating those open vistas which gave uninterrupted views of grand stately homes. But Scott preferred an aesthetic inspired by writers such as Burke and Uvidale Price, And in his 1824 novel Red Gauntlet, he indicates that his own taste is like that of his character Alan Hereford, more for wood and wilderness and for a scene of natural grandeur or beauty. And Scott outlines an ideal aesthetic whereby the land immediately round a house may be ornamented in a way that adheres to the architecture of the house, but that as you move out from that, the park should eventually connect themselves with the open countryside by having a bolder, wider, and more natural character, and that this should consist of broken ground or copsewood and of growing timber, and that this should imitate a state of wilderness, which makes, as he puts it, the strongest and most pleasing impression on all who are alive to natural beauty. But how can such landscapes be achieved? Scott suggests that you should use three materials: earth, water, and trees. And above all, he says, trees remain the proper and most manageable material of picturesque improvement. Now, Scott's emphasis on trees is important because the planting of trees is arguably his most important legacy for the natural landscape of Abbotsford, and it's intrinsically linked to his wider philosophies on the benefits of nature as he describes them in the journal. In the heart of Midlothian, the dying Laird of Dumbydykes gives his son a piece of advice. Jock, when you hae nothing else to do, you may aye be sticking in a tree. It'll be growing, Jock, when you're sleeping. Now, I think we should all take that advice, but certainly Scott took it on board himself when in 1811 he bought the farmhouse of Cartley Hole, which of course was to grow into Abbotsford. And even before he had actually taken possession of the house, he began to plant trees. As he made money from writing poems and writing novels, the once modest farm expanded from 110 acres to over 1,400 acres, and Scott continued to plant trees at an extraordinary rate. At some points, his creative impulses and his planting aesthetics coincide. For example, when he describes that he's acquired a gorge that he was to name Rymer's Glen, Scott claimed that this area of the estate was the place where True Thomas had met the Queen of Faery, an event described, of course, in Thomas the Rhymer. And in a letter to Joanna Baillie of 1818, he expresses excitement about having added this land to his own. And the description he gives seems to come straight out of his own poetry. I have a little wildwood glen, which I should delight to show you. It is a mere chasm with a streamlet trickling through it, but it is so well diversified with bushes, trees, and small cascade that it's quite a witch's dell. Moreover, I must tell you that the friend who assists me as overseer of my farm, who is a person of various attainments, and an especial good botanist, found the mistletoe in it in winter, and within these 2 days the enchanter's nightshade, which gave us great pleasure, as the place is called the Rymer's Glen, after Thomas the Rhymer, who met the Queen of the Fairies either there or somewhere else. Is it not a quiet and peaceable life when such things as these are matters of importance and the gravest occurrences of our 24 hours? I like that phrase, that True Thomas met her either there or somewhere else. But it was indeed Scott's enthusiasm for making landscapes and planting trees that was perhaps recognised as his greatest legacy, because he knew that these might far outlast his own literary endeavours. And he writes to Countess Pugstill in 1821, "My oaks will outlast my laurels," adding in jokey fashion, "and I pique myself more on my compositions for manure than on any other compositions whatsoever to which I was accessory." And Scott's not just being flippant here. In the same letter, he describes having a deep experience as a planter and a landscape gardener. And indeed, he did acquire a great knowledge of tree planting and pruning trees I could work at from morning to night, he says to Joanna Baillie. And it's interesting to note the number of books on tree planting he has in the library at Abbotsford. And of course, he reviewed Robert Monteith's The Forester's Guide and Profitable Planter, and also other works such as Sir Henry Stewart's book on transplanting trees, again showing his vast knowledge of this area. But one of the most detailed accounts of Scott's tree planting activities we have comes in a journal that's less well known than the one we're speaking about today, Scott's tree planting journal, which is called Silva Abbotsfordiensis, which is a manuscript held at Abbotsford and was transcribed by the for the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Collection Trust by myself and Professor Gerard Carruthers at Glasgow. That's available on the Advocates website if you want to look at it. Now, Scott indicates that this journal is intended as a vehicle for recording all the facts and experiences concerning the management of wood on the Abbotsford estate. And it begins on the 1st of January 1819, and it's clear that it was his intention to supplement it each year as conditions changed. To this purpose, Scott divides it into sections according to the areas of the Abbotsford estate, leaving space to update each of these on a yearly basis. He records what's been planted, how it has fared, or in some cases failed, because some things do fail, what he learns from that experience, and indeed how his vision for what this will achieve in the longer term will be, even when he knows he will never see these views himself. He laments no artist in this field could hope to see the perfection of his own labours, except if they live long or commence their labours early in life. And I'll just give you a brief extract from Silva to give you a sense of the kind of detail he provides, the care which he's taking over planting, and the ways in which he's applying the information he's gleaned from the books he's read to his own activities. Here he's describing the work he's done on the waterside Underhoch. March 1824, I removed the trees prepared on Sir Henry's plan, that's Sir Henry Stewart, that is having their roots cut round a year before, and lifting on the expiry of that period, divesting their roots of all the earth which adheres to them, and carefully of now incorporating them with the soil in which they're planted, by laying them out regularly and kneading the earth in by handfuls, observing that the centre or trunk of the tree should be kept highest in the ground and all the roots made to tend downwards to the extremity of the circle. So you can see really detailed information here. Now, the last entries for Silva, poignantly, are in 1825, just before Scott was to lose all his money in the financial crash, which of course put a stop to his planting of trees. And so it ends just before the journal that we're considering today begins. So how do these activities and philosophies relate to that more famous journal and to the theme of well-being that I'm considering today? While we recognise Scott's mental health struggles in his later life through the pages of the journal, we might forget that throughout his life, Scott suffered from periods of low spirit and depression, what he refers to in the journal as mullygrubs. So in 14th March 1826, as for myself, while I had scarce stirred to take exercise for 4 or 5 days, no wonder I had the mullygrubs. It is an awful sensation, though, and would have made an enthusiast of me had I indulged my imagination on devotional subjects. I've always been careful to place my mind in the most tranquil posture which it can assume during my private exercises of devotion. However, as the journal goes on, it offers a record of how these episodes were to become more acute after the financial crash of 1825 and the death of Charlotte. So while Scott struggled on valiantly to pay off his debts and those of his publishers, he offers a poignant and candid record of his lowness of spirits. However, we should note in the section of the journal that I just quoted, Scott attributes the particular attack of the mullygrubs to the fact that he had scarce stirred to take exercise for 4 or 5 days. And indeed, in the journal, Scott repeatedly notes that it's through walking and engaging with nature that he can fight with the fiend of depression. For example, Scott recounts how walking in nature helps relieve the anxiety he feels during his wife's terminal illness, reporting on 1st May 1826 that while his cousin is shocked by the melancholy change in Lady Scott, he consoles himself by walking to the western corner of the Chief's Wood plantation, making plans for planting more trees. On the 5th, he's haunted by gloomy thoughts, but his old friend Sir Adam Ferguson called and took a long walk with me, which was charity. On the 7th, he writes until his backbone ached, but adds, I believe it was a nervous affection, for a walk cured it. Lady Scott dies on 15th May 1826, and on the 24th, 2 days after the funeral, Scott reports, slept wretchedly, or rather waked wretchedly all night, and was very sick and bilious in consequence, and scarce able to hold up my head with pain. A walk, however, with my sons did me a good deal of good. Indeed, throughout the journal, Scott reports the ways in which engagement with nature helps restore his spirits. On 18th July 1827, Scott notes that his nerves have been bad, but reminds himself that he will benefit from exercise and from engagement with nature. The summer breeze brings the tears into my eyes, not unpleasingly, but I must exercise and case harden myself. There is no use in encouraging these moods of the mind. It is not the law we live on. An entry for 19th July again records the benefits of walking in his beloved estate. Walked through the glens till dinner time. I have written well, walked well, talked well, and have nothing to regret. Now, I don't think it's simply a romantic communing with nature that Scott's advocating here, but a more overt engagement with his beloved trees. As in the journal, he describes walking to Chiefswood, the glens of Huntley Barn and the lake. He is, of course, mapping out the ground he has described in Silva and where he has spent the years between 1811 and 1825 planting trees. In April 1826, for example, he notes that he's walking home by one of the 101 paths he had made through the woods he himself had planted. And when Scott is not at Abbotsford, but compelled to be in Edinburgh for court duties, the journal also records the ways in which he seeks out green spaces. On 3rd July 1828, it occurs to him that he has a key to Princes Street Gardens, and he notes, "Wherefore should I walk along the broiling and stifling streets when I have a little key in my bosom that can open any lock in Princes Street walks, and be thus on the castle banks, rocks and trees in a few minutes?" It's equally clear that even this walking in the city has done him good. "I made use of my key accordingly," he writes, "and walked from the Castle Hill down to Wallace's Tower, and thence to the west end of Princes Street, through a scene of grandeur and beauty, perhaps unequalled, whether in the foreground or the distant view is considered. All downhill too. Foolish never to have thought of this before. I chatted with the girls a good while after dinner, but wrote a trifle when we had tea." So you can see that this walk has done him good in Princes Street Gardens. Now, it's only very recently that we've fully come to recognise the benefits that can be gained from walking among trees. And Scott, of course, couldn't have known the scientific evidence that now underpins the relationship between walking in trees and well-being. Think of things like forest bathing, for example. But he seems to have had an intuitive sense of this and a curiosity about it too. In August 1827, for example, he observes after a walk to Rymer's Glen that while he's well aware that exercise should restore the nerves from the chill of numbness, which is allied to palsy, he is more curious about how he should restore elasticity to sinews that are too much relaxed. So he's thinking through, he recognises this does him good, but he's also thinking through why. Now, Scott's journal is a compelling but a difficult read, recording, as we've heard, his adversity in later years. But we should also recognise that it's a document about resilience and recovery. Towards its close, we do see signs of rejuvenation in Scott as he gradually recovers from the twin shocks of his financial losses and his wife's death. And this recovery, interestingly, is captured in his response to nature and the presence of trees. The freshness of the air, the singing of the birds, the beautiful aspect of nature, the size of the venerable trees, all gave me a delightful feeling this morning, he writes in May 1828. It seemed there was a pleasure even in living and breathing without anything else. And Scott, too, expresses this recovery by comparing himself to his beloved trees. Writing in June 1829, he notes, "I, too, old trunk as I am, have put out tender buds of hope, which seem checked for ever." At the opening of his journal, Scott recognises that his failure to keep a regular diary means I have myself lost recollection of much that was interesting, and I have deprived my family and the public of some curious information by not carrying this resolution into effect. In Silva, Scott also expresses a hope that it might be of interest to those whose lot it may be to walk under the shade of the trees which I am now engaged in planting. In both cases, Scott is recognising that the act of journaling provides a means of talking to the future, of continuing a conversation with those who come after us. As he does so often in his poems and novels, Scott is reminding us that the past and present can be in dialogue, whether it be through a natural landscape or, as in the journal, when rather than being shaped and organised by the writer, he throws aside all pretence to regularity and order and marks down events just as they occurred to recollection. Scott's work constantly reminds us that this dialogue is possible because the concerns and interests of the past are always recurring, if reimagined for different times. The foundational concept of all this work, I would suggest, that we have here. Critics like Susan Oliver have indeed suggested that so forward-looking are Scott's ideas in ecology and well-being that he emerges as an authorial precursor of 21st century environmentalism. It's no surprise then that people have taken the ideas that Scott expresses in his journal on walking, landscape and well-being and explored their perhaps surprising resonance for our own times. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in 2021, Kate Ferrier teamed up with the charity Hillgoers to take a group of people into the Cairngorms near Mar Lodge, where they reflected on Scott's exploration of walking, nature and well-being in the journal. The event prompted the mental health charity Black Dog Outdoors. It promoted that charity, and all who participated suggested that they made them consider both Scott and the connections between mental health and well-being in new ways. Sheena Stone's current exhibition at Abbotsford highlights the importance of the natural landscape that Scott created and what it meant to him in relation to his own creativity and well-being, interpreting this again in innovative ways, with many pieces inspired by quotes from the journal. These events offer new opportunities to enter into a creative conversation with Scott and the threads he draws so poignantly and so beautifully in the journal between mental health, walking and the natural world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ali.